For 20 years, we've been creating innovation in the CX industry, and now we're seeking out brilliant new perspectives on CX you just won't find anywhere else. I'm Richard Owen. Welcome to the CX Iconoclast. If you've never heard of the Department of Disruptive Capabilities, or think it's some part of the Harry Potter universe, well, this is the place to be to get up to speed. In this episode, I sit down with MIT senior lecturer and renowned efficiency expert Steve Spear to explore what makes the world's most innovative organizations truly tick. Drawing on his considerable expertise with Toyota, the US Navy, and many Fortune 500 leaders, Steve does what I think is an incredible job of unpacking the mechanics of high-velocity learning, why relentless experimentation, rapid problem solving, and dynamic adaptation separate market leaders from the rest. And zombies. Yeah, we spend quite a bit of time discussing zombies. You won't want to miss that bit. Perhaps more seriously, we focus on the intersection of AI, operational excellence, customer retention, and perhaps even discuss how B2B organizations apply that kind of Toyota-style innovation to drive growth, why traditional process improvement models tend to fall short in a currently data-driven world, and what lessons healthcare organizations, banks, and for that matter, many other types of organizations can learn from the playbooks that Steve helped implement in manufacturing and in the US Navy. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I know I certainly did. So, Steve, thanks very much for joining us. Appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely.
I'd love to start with something that Morris unearthed to us very recently, just before the meeting, that you'd been involved in setting up a department with the US Navy, and I want to make sure I get this right. It's called the Department of Disruptive Capabilities.
Yep.
And my first thought was, it sounds very Harry Potter to me. That's exactly right. What in the Harry Potter world they'd call to it. Tell us about the Department of Disruptive Capabilities, and does it involve illegal use of magic?
No. Yeah, it would appear that way. So, I think the formal term. So the effort originally started as the Unmanned Task Force, and then when it got institutionalized as the Disruptive Capabilities Office, DCO. And here's the quick background on this: is that the Navy, while an unusual institution by the missions it has and how it conducts those missions, is got a lot in common with any enterprise, right? Which is it establishes what it does and how it's going to do it. So in the business world, we say we have a business model. And the business model is fairly inclusive, right? Because it establishes whose needs are trying to serve, what services or products we're trying to provide, how we go about doing that, how we measure success and failure, et cetera. And in the military, they have terms which mean more or less the same thing: concepts of operations, operating concepts, et cetera. And so the Navy has established its operating concepts or concepts of operation coming out of the great successes of the Second World War. And those are, highly carrier-centric, very dependent on air power, that kind of thing. As we are progressing into, all this revolutionary new technology and a whole different profile of the market space, right? Different adversaries presenting different threats. The question arose, if the market is shifting, and I'm using that with some air quotes, but as the market is shifting, and as is the available to science and technology to meet the needs of the market, as it were, again, air quotes around that, what does the Navy do? And the overwhelming answer out of the innovation community is that you have to set up something which is a standalone. And this goes back to Clay Christensen when he wrote about the innovator's dilemma, the innovator's solution. A guy who's a real luminary around innovation now, a fellow named Steve Blank, now at the Gordian Knot Center at Stanford. Both of them say, look, if you try to innovate inside the existing organization, the norms, the business models, the processes are going to squash the innovation, or the innovation is going to be disruptive to your way of conducting your normal business. And so Navy leadership took those messages to heart and created this thing called the Unmanned Task Force. And what it was an opportunity outside the, as Christensen would call it, the sustaining or the legacy business models, as Blank would call it, an innovation versus an execution organization, to just see what worked. And the Unmanned Task Force was linked to a number of different fleets and strike groups and whatnot. And there was no preconceived notion about how to use things like autonomous vehicles. It was just put things in the water and see what capability it gave you. And it was the idea was, like with any good innovation, to rapidly experiment and rapidly gain experience. So you're having feedback to shape your understanding of the space in which you're trying to operate. So that was the motivation for creating this unmanned task force. And then they kind of proved that by doing this, stepping outside the sustaining or the legacy approaches and giving opportunity to try new things, you can actually not only deliver new technological capability, but behavioral capability. You know, the processes, the routines, et cetera, to, again, some air quotes around this, deliver different types of values to meet different needs than had been the case before. So anyway, when Navy leadership saw the success that was being won out of this unmanned task force, they said, this is really a capability of just being disruptive that we should have. And so then it got institutionalized as this Disruptive Capabilities Office.
Really, really interesting story, especially in an era where everyone's talking about DOGE, right? Which is
right.
Sort of in some ways trying to be a disruptive force, whether you like it or hate it or disagree with it. But the word disruption features very prominently.
Yeah.
Maybe we're going to give disruption a bad name, or maybe disruption's always had a bad name.
Well, I think, look, I don't want to get too political on this, but credit to Clay Christensen and Steve Blank. Both of them have characterized innovation, whether it's disruptive or not, as a creative experience, which is premised on a very, very energetic and productive discovery dynamic. That in Steve Blank's terminology, he leads with, if you want to do something innovative, get out of the building. And the reason is, in the building, the only thing in your head already is what's already worked. Yeah. But if you're trying to be innovative, do something new, you got to get out of the building into a new problem space with new problem holders, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's important to say that disruptive innovation, or innovation of any type, is a creative process which sometimes leads to new science and technology, but more to the point of both Blank and Christensen, it leads to new ways of doing new things. Other disruption is just using a sledgehammer. And if you think about disruptive innovation, it's trying to take the unknown, which is a high entropy situation, and get some understanding, which is a structured situation. Disrupting with a sledgehammer is taking what's already ordered and stable and creating chaos. So thermodynamically, they're going in very opposite directions.
What two things pop into my head hearing you talk. One is Jeffrey Moore has written a lot recently also about the challenge corporations, especially tech companies where he tends to focus, have on disrupting themselves. And it's sort of a riff on the same idea that you have from Christensen and Blank, but with a focus on capital structures and impediments. The idea that venture to some extent fills a gap in the economy with businesses that are willing to lose significant or invest significantly, I should say.
Right.
You wouldn't appreciate the
word
lose.
They're not in the business of losing.
Like the word. Well, looking at the odds, they are in the business of losing, but you could argue that they prefer the term invest. You've got significant losses, let's say, on the P&L in belief that there's a very significant payoff. And that capital structure is a real impediment to existing large tech companies being competitive, similar to the innovation dilemma. The other thing that pops into my head when I hear you talk about it is Schumpeter, right? I mean, you're sort of going, because one of the most primary foundations of economics is the idea that you get disruption, although largely disruption from new entrants.
Right.
And this problem of existing companies disrupting, which is a good segue to the phrase you used, don't be a zombie organization. So we've gone from Harry Potter and magic to zombies. There's a theme emerging here, but zombie organizations. Tell us what a zombie organization is.
Yeah, I just realizing with your references, it's an accurate representation of both my intellectual and emotional development that I'm anchored somewhere. I'm anchored somewhere in mid-childhood in comic books. So anyway, but that's fine. I mean, it's an accurate description of reality. As far as so in terms of the zombie organizations, so if you go back to everything we've been talking about so far, and I think more broadly, when you see organizations succeed, sometimes you look at them and it could be Google versus Yahoo, Amazon versus everybody else. So Walmart is really trying to close that gap there. Apple versus Nokia, Toyota versus anyone in the auto industry. When you look at the leaders, you say, oh, there can't be anything in common because they're so different by product, market, science, technology, et cetera, et cetera. However, what you do realize is that the challenge in any enterprise simply doesn't matter whether it's tech, high tech, biotech, industry, heavy industry. The issue is getting people to be able to coordinate and collaborate on solving really, really hard problems. That full stop on that one, right? And that's the common theme. And we were talking about that with Christensen and Blank about getting out of the building into the problem space, to see problems so you can solve them. So anyway, carrying that over to zombie organizations is if we take the premise, and that's really been the premise of my work for like almost 30 years now, which is the winners are those who are much better able to solve hard problems better, faster, quicker, easier, and more of them. Then so the antithesis of that good behavior, that very productive competitive behavior, is not solving problems. And so I did a video for the MIT Sloan Executive Education Program a bunch of years ago, and it got some people like it because the rhetorical question was, well, what do you want to not do? And the answer was, you don't want to be a zombie organization, right? You don't want to be just continuously plodding through life unresponsive to the difficulties in your way, like this. That what you want to do is very, very rapidly see problems and solve problems so you get to a better situation all along. And just to finish up on the zombie thing in the video, I compare, zombies which succeed because there's just a mass of them. And the analogy being that, the reason enterprises sink is not because of one failure which causes catastrophe. It's just the accumulation of wear and tear and things that don't go recognized and resolved. And then, if you watch those movies, it's always some small group of people who manage to defeat the hordes of zombies. And why is that? Because the zombies, they just keep plodding on, where the small group of people are constantly trying to be inventive and innovative and creative because they're so outnumbered. And it's actually not a bad analogy for what happens in the market space, where you may have these legacy organizations which are blessed with enormous resources and history and internal capability, et cetera, and using Christensen's terms, they get disrupted by an innovator who's blessed with far less stuff. And why is that? It's because the innovator is solving new problems better, faster, more persistently than the legacy zombie.
Yeah. So, obviously in tech, that's very common because you have fundamentally the whole startup ethic is
right.
You exist because you're there to disrupt, and you wouldn't exist if there wasn't an opportunity to disrupt, right?
Right.
All the disadvantages with being small, being a startup. Within companies, though, this applies equally, right? So you've got small teams trying to create disruption. It seems to me like the question is whether or not the leadership of an organization is ready to sponsor that,
right?
Recognizing that to some extent, and obviously they're going to put it a lot more politely, but recognizing in large organizations they may have 80% zombification. And if they're going to do something different, they're going to have to provide air cover and sponsorship for these small teams that want to do something different.
Right.
And that's possibly, as we start to look at the application of new advantage technologies, and obviously we're here to talk about AI to some degree, this becomes very salient because whenever there's a technological disruption, you have efforts for innovation, disruption of business models, application of technology to new ideas, and you have the zombification effect. And doesn't it just come back to leadership at the end of the day? You talk about the executive ed program. Look, everybody, if you don't want to be a zombie organization, is that the natural state for every large business that you're going to have to disrupt?
Yes. So it is a fantastic question, right? So look, we suffer this individually, and we suffer this as, enterprises, collectives of some, whether it's a commercial collective or a social collective, which is once we succeed at something, then we shift over from sort of that paranoia driven insistence on trying to recognize problems and solve them, and then at some point we say, hey, we're in a groove now. We just got to keep doing what we're doing. The groove becomes a rut at some point. And, your question leads in a very strong direction here, which is fundamentally succeeding doing what we've been doing, or succeeding at new things, innovating, is a behavioral thing. It's not a science and technology thing per se. It's a behavior on how we use that stuff, perhaps. And so as far as leadership goes, it's an important point that leadership recognizes that what we're doing is important to continue doing, because society, one, depends on us doing this, and it rewards us in return. However, we also have to be thinking about new things to do, because nothing is static. And so you mentioned venture capital, and certainly, our economy and our society has set up mechanisms where people can go outside their enterprise. Someone at MIT or wherever else has a brilliant new idea, and they want to scale it, commercialize it. And unfortunately, there's a venture capital to say, hey, we'll help you, we'll fund the discovery process for you. Now, there are times, though, where you even have these large successful enterprises which internally recognize the need to create this protected space for discovery. So, we started with reference to the Navy and this creation of this unmanned task force, which then institutionalizes as a disruptive capabilities office. The other example I'll give, because my research roots are with Toyota, and I've been a 30 years continuing student at Toyota. If you look at what they did with the hybrid, there they were in the late 1900s, before end of the 20th century, and they're thinking, we really got to think through what will be the 21st century car. And that's where they started. They didn't start off with like, oh, we need batteries and hybrid, this, that. Just like, thinking ahead, what are some of the issues that, our customers will want in cars in the 21st century that maybe is different than the 20th century, where we had this huge explosion in success. And so they set up a team, and credit to the Toyota leaders is they said, we're going to put you outside the normal organization, because we don't even know the problem that we're trying to solve for, let alone the answer. And they put a team out there, and the team had the realization that fuel efficiency was going to be a huge issue. And fortunately, because they were outside the normal Toyota processes for product design and development, they were able to entertain this idea of hybrid and explore technology and the fusion of technology in ways that had never been done in the auto industry. They created partnerships with people who had great expertise on batteries and motors and software, et cetera, that Toyota never had to entertain before. And what popped out of that was the Prius. And then out of the Prius then came the scaling onto the Camry as the cab driver's car of choice, because the cost of fuel is half of in a normal car, and then into the Lexus line. And so I think Toyota now is up to 20 plus million copies of hybrid sold, which, no one can compare to that. It's just off the charts. So anyway, what's the point is that your question about leadership, recognizing that if we're going to succeed, we have to create the platforms on which people can have very exploratory experimental discovery, boom. And sometimes it's through venture capital, because you can't do it internally, you're just very small. But in the most visionary leadership, they actually realize how to do it inside a very successful enterprise already.
It seems like the common thread when you start to think about that kind of internal disruption, and it doesn't matter, as you say, whether or not it's a change in the nature of technology, or it's a challenge in the fundamentals of your business model.
Yep.
But at some level, somebody's sitting around a table going, the existing organization is going to struggle to get there. We're going to have to do something different. And I can think of a couple of examples. One of the things I always think, I know it's a much overused case study, but I always think about Netflix's transition from shipping discs to digital.
Yep.
If you're sitting around a table with a bunch of Netflix execs, circa, I guess, early 2000s, what are they good at? They're good at warehousing. They're good at logistics and shipping, right? And to sit there and say, no, the company of the future has no future in any of this. Warehouses are going to shut down. Everyone who works in the warehouse are going to be gone. Everyone who has competency in supply chain, you're out of a job. It's all digital. that wasn't an easy internal sell. Took a lot of effort, right? Another example close to my heart was when I was working at Dell Computer in the 90s. A lot of people don't realize that when Dell set up its internet business, Dell.com, and my predecessor before I ran Dell.com was the founder of that, Michael had carved it out as a separate business unit, exactly the way you're describing it. Now, it's hard to imagine a company that's in the technology space that was growing, 150% a year, that's incredibly successful, deciding, you know what, the future business model is too disruptive for our existing company. We're going to carve it out. So it almost suggests that management philosophy is not necessarily a product of success or failure. It's a fundamental attitude towards the future. Yeah. Because even in a very successful company like Dell, and it's staggeringly successful, the CEO is willing to say, you know what, I still think we're going to disrupt the future. Same with Netflix. And yet, and pause for your answer here, companies that are far, far less successful, grounded in low growth, poor earnings performance, are absolutely sitting around the executive staff table, zombifying, to use your language. So it's not performance that cultivates change.
No, I think, like you said, is there's some leaders who are not only comfortable but desirous of discovering new things, and it does speak to then if you're going to have this as your competitive strategy for an enterprise, is someone like Michael Dell, is he cultivating a similar almost paranoia-driven curiosity in others that when Dell.com is thriving and succeeding, they say, you know what, let's go try something new in the meantime. I'm not really taking an issue with you, but I'll just a slightly different phrasing on this is if we go back to what the luminaries on innovation have told us, is that most innovations aren't like someone is sitting here and they have a grand vision of a future state, and then they say, hey guys, let's get together and just design towards that. Rather, they say, I wonder if there's something new out there, and we're going to start experimenting. And at least Christensen's work is exactly that, which is when he starts talking about disruptive innovation, he has one beautiful example. It's the disruption of the steam shovel industry by the backhoe industry. And in Christensen's, and I'm going to compress and take out a lot of meaningful detail and probably accuracy too. He says no one sat around and said, "Oh, those steam shovels depended on fossil fuels to generate pressurized steam. That's a wildly ineffective way to do things. We're going to just build these gigantic hydraulic pneumatic devices to do mining and excavation for construction." He said it started off with someone in California looking at the new farming season and not wanting to dig irrigation ditches with pickaxes and shovels. And he's thinking this through with some friends, and they say, well, we have tractors, which is a way to get horsepower into the field. Maybe we can rig something up. And there's a picture of the first backhoe. And it looks like two guys built it in their garage. And then the way the narrative goes is that they start digging, irrigation ditches. And then someone says, hey, that's pretty good. That's better than pickaxes and shovels. Can you use that for a trench? And they say, oh, no, not our thing, because the trench is much deeper and wider and more dangerous. But they say, maybe we can tinker with this and get it to be a trench digger and not just a ditch digger. And anyway, the point is through the incremental iteration that you get to the backhoe that can do mining. And so I suspect, and I don't have insight into Netscape like I would some of these others, but I suspected Netscape, they said, dang, this internet thing, what's going on with that? And someone said, I don't know, why don't you go over there and just start running some tests and see where it takes us? And for those first tests, I suspect no one at Netscape said, quick, shorten the leases on our warehouses and fire our package carriers. No, they said, no, keep doing that. We're making a lot of money. And similarly with Dell, I got to believe that initially Michael Dell was like, which was like Jeff Bezos also, I wonder if we can sell stuff on the internet. Go give it a try.
Yeah. And well, in fact, I remember the first time I was introduced to Mosaic, I didn't get it.
Right.
These hypercards is this thing, and then you can get access to these different hypercards, and they're stacked, and they have information. I'm like, what? Okay.
Right.
And I think that process of going, well, go see what you can do with it.
Yeah.
And that's playing out very much today in the world of AI. You've got both phenomena going on. You've got a certain reticence to disrupt what we're currently doing.
Right.
And then secondly, a sort of sense that, well, the smarter companies are saying, well, let's go see what can we accomplish? Let's go try A, B, and C. I'd like to segue a little bit to your work on healthcare, because that's an industry, and I just got back from the UK, and, you have this very vigorous debate, as I'm sure you know, in the United Kingdom. National Health Service basically is gradually going bankrupt.
Right.
And it can't really go bankrupt. It's the government, but the sense is that it's going to drain the economy of its last nickel and still not be very good potentially. You've got US privatized medicine, very expensive. What's your take on that? Is that an industry that defies? Well, first of all, is it a zombie industry? Is it zombifying? Probably a bad analogy for a health industry to be zombified, I guess.
Yeah. I wrote a book about a year ago, the most recent book called Wiring the Winning Organization. Wrote it with a guy named Gene Kim, who's a big luminary in the IT field, DevOps, that kind of thing. And if you really distill down that book, we go through a couple of things. One, all else equal, but for outcomes. There are those folks who are doing the same thing, and they just they're much better able to generate and deliver value into society. And that's true in healthcare. We've seen it, and we've helped replicate, twice the patients with far less overburden on staff with much better outcomes, right? So it's doable. And then we say, well, the issue here really is, are you creating conditions in which it's much easier for people to collaborate and coordinate to solve hard problems than not, all right? And then we say, well, how do you do that? So in terms of healthcare, let's talk about how not to do that first. So I know nothing about what the British do, but I have worked with public sector colleagues here, and I've worked in healthcare here. So I'll do as best to triangulate on that.
I'll add a British accent to what you're saying. We'll call
All right, there you are. There, that's right. I have. It's funny. Like when you want someone to be believable in an American movie, give them a British accent. It's like, oh well,
or a villain, Right, we had our run of villains. To be fair,
That's right. Well, the villain, you have to have the accent plus the bald cat. Anyway, there we go. But as far as healthcare, I think it's a common problem. And in the wiring book, we talk about this in one of the vignettes, where you have people with specialty, and the temptation then, and for good reason, is to manage them through functional silos. But the problem is when you put people into functions, you fragment their effort and make it very, very hard for them to work together. So that becomes a common failure mode and sort of a precursor for zombiness, I suppose. And the other is you create situations in which you don't give people the committed time to solve really hard system problems, quote unquote pre-production, because you're under this pressure to maintain the operating tempo. And so you couple that, which is we're isolated in silos, so it's hard to collaborate to begin with. And then we're not allowed the time to solve system problems pre-production. So what ends up happening? We're forced to then try and figure out problems on the fly. And then, Richard and Stephen Maurice saying, oh, hey, I really need this thing. And then Maurice says, well, if you told me 2 weeks ago, you would have had it. And, I'm kind of limited into what I can give to you now. So when we've done work in the U.S. healthcare system, again, with, whatever advantages and disadvantages there are with private payer and compensation and all pre-approvals and all that crazy, frustrating stuff, the common issue we find is whether it's at the local level within a practice across a larger system, like within a hospital or even a healthcare system, the fragmentation and the inability of people to solve problems together, that's a major impediment. And then the lack of committed time to solve problems pre-production, that's a killer too. And actually, it's not just figuratively, sometimes literally a killer too. But the good news is, if you help people create flow over function or system out of silo, and give those systems, those flows, opportunity to debug their approaches before they actually have to apply them, you can get much, much better outcomes. much better.
Why is that any different than business, however? I mean, everything you're describing seems to me typical of corporations, right? We've built functional specialism because we thought that creates efficiency. And certainly from the universe, we live in, if you're going to create great customer outcomes, you have to some extent find a way to overcome those functional silos, sometimes, frankly, at the expense of efficiency for overall effectivity from the end product, right? And yet many companies and the word you didn't use here, which I thought was interesting, was incentives, right? And at the end of the day, is it partly an incentive structure problem? Are we creating the wrong measures and the wrong incentives?
Yeah. So I get a little defensive. I'll explain why when people talk about incentives versus metrics. And the reason for that is, you mentioned Doge and, people talk about public servants here. And it's probably true in other countries as well, is that, if they just had the better incentives, they'd be more committed. Look, I can't speak for every one of the many, many people who work for governments in the United States, but the ones I've had privilege to work with, and I don't use the word privilege lightly, is they're very, very mission oriented. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And when they show up not just to collect a paycheck, but because they really think that in the public service, they're actually in a service role. They take that very seriously, emotionally and behaviorally and otherwise. So then it gets in the question, so why do things not work so well? Well, again, it gets back to this fragmentation thing, is that you can do all sorts of local measurements and local optimization within a function, but unless it's clear how that function flows into the accomplishment of a mission, you can have people working very, very hard and with very good intent, but not in support of a mission. I think what we have in healthcare is, look, I got a bill from some encounter with the medical, and you get every little bit and piece is billed, but not for the treatment or the diagnostic or whatever else it is. And you think about that in the private sector. When you go to Toyota or anyone else to buy a vehicle, you pay for the vehicle and a warranty that comes with it. You don't pay for the tires separate from the engine, separate from the interior. That would be insane. And look, Toyota crushed some of its world competitors because Toyota organized around the design and delivery of a car, and they were organized around departments of engineering and research and design and fabrication, boom, boom, boom. And again, it's very hard to collaborate, coordinate when you're organized around function without the function embedded into and subordinate to the flow.
Yeah, it's interesting your comments about governments and how it also applies to healthcare. In some ways, I think that I'm a big believer in market forces, right? But in our efforts to somehow trim the negative effects of market forces, we can create an environment where the positive effects of market forces are completely lost.
Right.
And I think to some extent in the States, we're struggling with that balance. We see the same thing in insurance markets, interestingly enough, in the United States. We don't want people to be subject to the full, if you like, the full hard force of the market.
Right.
So we try and smooth off the edges. And then the more we try and smooth off the edges, ultimately at some point we end up with something that's lost the whole benefit of the private market completely. It's no longer competitive and innovative. It's simply a compliance-orientated universe.
Yep.
And so there's that's why to some extent you worry about incentives, because not even necessarily at the individual level, but do we create, the beauty of the free market arguably is that it creates incentives for the principals and the agents.
Right.
And once we strip those incentives away, what we're left with is zombies by definition, because the incentives are, you're well satisfied being a zombie, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, look, we can speculate it. I think your framing on this is outstanding in terms of principal agents, incentives, and that sort of thing. Again, I spend a lot of my time, as a researcher back when that was my primary activity, and now as a collaborator with folks. I spend a lot of time at the point of work. And like I was saying about people in the public sector and in healthcare, the people at the point of work, my experience is overwhelmingly committed to mission. It's rare to find the nurse, the orderly, the technician, the pharmacist, the doctor who doesn't really care about giving his or her whole for the betterment of the patient's condition. Full stop on that. When I go into the public sector, despite all the stereotypes and caricatures, it's pretty good on, sitcoms and whatnot. By and large, the public sector people I've dealt with are really committed towards making things better for the public they serve. I'll even throw this out here, which is, the IRS. I work for myself. I have a lot of different clients. So at least every year or two, I've got to have some conversation with the IRS. Just, it's the nature of my business. I call them up and they answer right away. And I find when I'm talking to an IRS agent, they're trying to make my life as easy as possible to do the right thing without being penalized. So anyway, there's that. So where's the incentive problem? If anything, it's at the senior levels of organizations where senior people are somehow insulated from the consequences of their decisions and their actions, or the consequences of not deciding and not acting. And they're not willing to go to the point of work and figure out what is it making harder for the people for whom they're responsible to generate and deliver value.
I think that's a perfect note to end on, because in some ways it sort of brings us right back to the whole starting point of zombie organizations and leadership, right? And, this idea of, satisficing, the concept that at some point you become just, you're willing to suboptimally drive results because, you've got a pretty cushy life, you're 3 years from retirement, why take on things? And, it's the actions at the top, and I agree with you completely. The experience of most frontline employees, especially in the customer experience space, people want to do the right thing. They are highly motivated to do the right thing. They are not given necessarily the tools they want.
Bingo.
Yes, I guess at the end of the day, we can say it boils down to leadership. But I think what you've done today is put a much finer point on aspects of leadership that really matter when it comes to creating these great results. So I'll leave you with the last word on it. Does that wrap it up?
I'm interrupting you only to agree with you enthusiastically. Look, well, it's not just like a philosophical thing. We have the evidence, right? Which is you have organizations, when you look at the organization and its performance as a whole, the performance may be really terrible. This was true of a General Motors plant that General Motors closed in frustration out in Fremont, California. When I worked closely with the folks at aluminum maker Alcoa, they had facilities that they had acquired from competitors, which were really, really poor in terms of safety, quality, cost, et cetera, et cetera. Healthcare providers, where we've had opportunity to work, where every day was huge overburden on staff and huge underservicing of patients and their families. That's the compelling thing. It's not Toyota versus General Motors. It's the before and the after, where before things were not so good for any of the stakeholders, and after they're fantastic. And the one thing that didn't change was the workforce. It was exactly the same people equipped with the same science and the same technology to create the same products and services. So what changed? Leadership. How leadership behaved and how they acted, and the conditions leadership created and sustained and improved for the people for whom they were responsible. And when leadership took on very dearly that opportunity and that responsibility for creating much better conditions for people in which they could succeed, boom, the enterprise as a whole is fantastic. And on the other hand, when leadership said, oh, no, I'm going to blame the workforce for this, then the enterprise didn't improve at all. And again, unfortunately, just like you said, Asian principle and way incentives work and rewards and all that, very often leadership not accepting their responsibility to do great things, the consequences aren't necessarily on the leader, they're on the people for whom they should have been responsible. So full stop on that.
That's a great note to end on. Steve, thank you very much. Absolutely brilliant. We could talk for hours. Really enjoyed it.
I much appreciate the invitation and the conversation. I hope it is the start of a dialogue.
Thanks for listening to the CX Iconoclast from OCX Cognition. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you won't miss any of our thought-provoking conversations. And please get in touch if you want to learn more about what OCX Cognition's predictive CX analytics platform can do for your business by providing complete insights into every account, continuously updated and connected to operations. You'll find contact info in the show notes.